Sergio. We are live on Facebook.
We are? Okay, yes, awesome.
So hello everybody for our emotional trauma and healing chat number 20. Sergio, how about that?
Let's go. Yes. It's great. How are you? How are you, Daniel?
I'm very good. Thank you. And how are you?
Pretty good. I went to sleep a little late, so got a long. I woke up late, but I got good sleep. So just ready to talk about these awesome talks and try to delve into specific topics as much as we can to see if it's something that it's going to benefit people listening to this. And some of these things may sound like they are. There's so many things in trauma that sound similar, but there's just so many details that affect each person differently. And I think it's important that we're able to touch on each specific topic to reach. Everybody's a different world. Everybody's got different things. And just because trauma affects us all in one way or another doesn't mean that we can look at it the same way. So, that's why we're here. So,
well, let's before we start, let's just very quickly define trauma, because some of our new viewers might not know what we call trauma, because we're not talking about trauma as a car accident or car crash or war or something really horrible, what you usually see in TV and have talk shows about. We are talking, when we talk about trauma, we talk about every moment when you do not feel calm, peaceful, and light, like this light feeling. Like when you had a backpack which was heavy and you put it aside and then you're like, okay, this light feeling. That is whenever you do not feel calm, peaceful, light, or as we say, CPL, we call that a trauma moment. Okay. And so it's not necessarily something really, really complicated. It can be something small, like your mommy didn't look at your drawing, and now every time you draw something and show it to your boss, you're like, oh, I don't know if he likes it, and there's some heaviness inside of you. That already is a trauma moment for us.
Absolutely. So and I think that's above everything else, that's what we want to do, and that's what we're trying to drive at changing the paradigm that most of us hold, because we've been essentially so conditioned to think of trauma as this one specific thing that is just incredibly overwhelming, and mostly as adults, right? Although kids have car accidents as well, but we tend to think as trauma as this just one absolutely tangible thing we can think of as like, okay, only that is trauma. And that's what we're here for. We're here to explain that, like you said, it's a great definition that you have, as well as that the Institute for the Study of Peak States developed to kind of change people's minds and to say what can be worked on. It's not just car accidents and war and sexual assault, but I just think trauma is not the best word, and so I like the definition better, because we tend to encompass things into that. But big T, little t traumas tends to work as well too, although it seems to diminish a little bit. Little t traumas, right? Like it's a little trauma.
So it's just a little, but it's
just a little trauma.
Yeah, don't worry about it. Just little. No, that doesn't. I mean, even a little trauma can heavily influence your life, change your behavior in a way that is not beneficiary for you. So so that's why I think the Institute came up with that definition. I like it very much. Every moment you do not feel CPL, you do not feel calm, peaceful, and emotionally light, is what we call trauma. And the good news is you don't have to suffer through it, but there are tools to resolve it. And in these chats, we just talk about these tools, and we talk about trauma, we talk about subjects all around it. And I guess you have a good subject for today as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's kind of the point, right? We're moving towards more models that tend to allow you to kind of step into these spaces within yourself that are very difficult to get to. So last time we talked about the unconscious and, our conscious selves, and how much of us is really present and how much of us is actually just kind of on cruise control or not thinking about our situations. And that is because we tend to be living with a lot of these difficult emotions. And one thing I wanted to say before we delve into this topic of resistance, and working through these feelings, is that I do think that excuse me, I do think that we're moving more towards finding ways to connect the old thinking with this new thinking, that, and we already talk about it, and that's when in the general public we talk about things like triggering, like this triggered me, and unfortunately it also has this like negative connotation, like somebody's being triggered, and it's been politicized a little bit. But I do think that in general we all say that sometimes. We all just say in general, like, oh, like, I was playing this game and I like this triggered me, or he said something that triggered me or pissed me off, or and that language is literally what we're talking about here. Is just, you could be upset by something that somebody else does not even give a second thought about. We've all been there when, or maybe not all of us, that's kind of the whole point. We've all been there when maybe we're driving and somebody says, they flick you off or they cut you, and you're upset about that for a whole day, or you just can't get it out of your head, or somebody said something to you and you wish you would have had a response. You wish you could have said the right thing back, and you think about it, and then a day later it's like, oh, I should have said this, right?
Or you train, like the next time I'm going, if that happens again, then I train and I do this and this, and you rehearse that over and over in your head.
Yeah, or there are many people who I used to think when I was younger I was the only one, but that whenever I was confronted, I felt like I kind of froze. I had a set of tools that worked to get through that situation, but they weren't the tools that I wanted to. So these are all the things we're talking about. They're how our body reacts to those situations, which sometimes tends to be beyond our conscious awareness, whether it's responding with anger, whether it's not responding how you want to, whether it's thinking about it all day. These are things that trigger you. And to the person next to you, those things may not affect them at all. So why?
Exactly.
And it is because we are charged with a specific thing that we've been holding for a long time. And if we're able to kind of let it go in one way or another, our behavior will change. Now,
Definitely.
the thing that we're talking about here is trauma healing techniques, and they are wonderful. They can do a lot of great things. Let's just focus on the ones that are more well known right now, that are seem to be at the forefront, which is somatic experiencing, EMDR, and tapping, EFT. Now, the Institute tends to have its own form of EFT, and that's what you teach your clients, and that's how you work with your clients, right? You teach them techniques that allow them to process emotions without the caveat here is that without having to fully feel all of it and get to this crazy painful point, correct?
That's correct. And without even re-experiencing the moment. So whenever that moment is, sometimes we have to go close to that moment to just get the idea of the emotion that was present in that moment. But we don't have that re-experiencing like other also well-known and established trauma healing techniques have, where they re-experience or re-put you through that situation again and again and again and try to desensitize you, which from my point of view, after knowing these techniques, is quite cruel. Yeah? Because it's like, why would you put somebody over and over and over again in the situation? I think even the Institute found out that this might even be re-traumatizing to that person if that is done incorrectly, that re-experiencing. While re-experiencing can work in certain setups, if it's done incorrectly, there's re-traumatization. But again, if there is something you have been triggered, then basically trauma has activated you. There has been an activation of trauma inside of you. And now your body responds with a fight, flight, or as you said, freeze response. Okay, so that's what the body does when there is a situation it cannot process. So then it resorts to fight, flight, or freeze.
Okay.
And that's it.
Okay. How are you able to process something without having to fully be there, though? You have to kind of at least activate part of it, right?
As I said, part of it. So if you imagine trauma being like a pole, okay, and you can decide how close you go to the pole. If you go here, and trauma might radiate, so you feel it very, very close. But if you go like this, you just have a hunch about, okay, that's more or less like this feeling of fear or this feeling of helplessness or something. That's what I had in that moment. And that's already enough. Okay. And then we can work with it.
Okay. But you at least have to, what are the parameters? You have to just think about how you felt. Do you have to feel how you felt? Do you have to, what kind of response do you need to have in your body? Even if it's just, 10 feet away from the pole for the process to work. Because I know sometimes, go ahead.
We need emotion. We need the emotion. You need to have an idea of how you felt, what the emotion in that moment was. And then there are certain other questions which we ask around that emotion, okay?
Yeah.
To basically localize it even better. And then we apply or perform the trauma healing techniques, and then trauma dissolves.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And even though, so I've been, as some people who've been listening to this might know, I've been on this, and so have you. But for my perspective in these chats is always as not the professional, the person who's trying to live this and trying to help people along the way who may be curious about this, who, just a lay person who's interested in this, in bettering themselves and working through their issues. So my questions always come from that perspective. Now, working with other modalities and thinking about the perspective of, or doing the things that are more where you have to get closer for your body to kind of let go of that stuff. I can speak from a very strong perspective about how sometimes along the way, there are certain things that happen that block you from reaching that destination of healing. And I'm talking about specifically inner processes. So, it could be, there are things that happen that stop you. There are certain things within you that might say, hold on, hold your horses. This is too much info. This is too much stuff. And it could be simple things like along the course of the past few years, I've noticed that my thinking, I overthink. I start thinking, am I doing this the right thing? Am I feeling the right thing? I have fear. I have, there was a point where I was like incredibly frustrated. I would get incredibly angry doing this process. I felt like I just was awful at this. Like it didn't make sense. And I would just feel like this amount of rage, and that rage distracted me from the work, or it was its own set of trauma, but they didn't allow me to get to what I was feeling at the moment that I wanted to tackle and listen to. One of the greatest antidotes has been feeling love, acceptance, compassion, and that's something you teach.
Yes.
And it's an incredible tool. It's an incredible tool, especially once you start realizing you can kind of call it at will, and it's like a muscle. It's really cool. So that's, resistances seem to be a big topic, and there are modalities to specialize just on that alone. Internal systems, constellation, somatic experiencing kind of teaches you that you to go slowly in and out to try titrate, because you might not be able to go full head on against a specific traumatic feeling, sensation, or emotion. Is that still an issue with the tapping techniques?
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a great question. But before we answer that question, I would like to talk about the resistance in the first place, because resistance is a word which describes a behavior. Let's take a very, very obvious resistance. So you have your appointment with your trauma therapist, and it's at 3 p.m. And at 12 p.m., you start to wonder, is my house clean enough? And then you just look around, and then you see there's some dirt. And you wonder, this dirt needs to go away, because this next weekend, my mother-in-law or whoever comes and visits. And then you just take the vacuum cleaner and clean it. And then you notice the windows. And then you notice this. And then it's already 2:30, and you have a 45-minute drive to your therapist. And then, you have to just call in sick or whatever. Yeah, just whatever happens, right? Mm-hmm. So is that just coincidence, or is that, for example, a resistance? Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so this is like very obvious. So the probability of immediate sickness, which wasn't there in the morning, is very low. But still, it's a nice way of putting that you won't show up. But why are we doing this? Because we need a way to cope with that emotion as well. So you might go to the therapist because of something that happened in school, but there's another issue inside of you which perhaps says, I don't like to be exposed. I don't like to be talked to by a man, by a woman, or whatever. So it's a different issue than the issue you go for to your therapist. And that issue is also present. And it comes up, it gets triggered when you're at the therapist, but there's one part of you that wants to be at the therapist, or because you perhaps have talked, there are reasons which might bring you to the therapist. And another part of you is scared of it. So if you look into the mirror, you always think that you are just one, because you have the definition of one person if you look into the mirror. But actually you have multiple awarenesses inside of you. We know that because there's like this angel and this devil metaphor which you use in Hollywood movies and so on. So you know that you're not only one, because you learned so many things, and you learned you were programmed in so many ways by your parents, by your uncles, aunts, by your teachers, by your neighbors, by your classmates as well, that everything you learned is not like a clean program, like a computer programmer tries to put into computers so that it doesn't break. But you have many, many programs, and these programs might interact and might be conflicting as well.
Right. So would you go ahead?
Yeah. No, please ask.
Would you say those specific parts are individual because they are trauma filled, like they have their own difficulties, they have their own unprocessed emotions?
Well, let's not mix the models. So first of all, to understand, you are not one. So you have different opinions about a thing. And then if you go to that therapist, one opinion might be, I want to get better. And the other opinion might be, I don't want to be exposed.
Right.
So depending on your mood and on your day, the wanting to get better might have more than 51% of the votes inside of you, and the other one. But then whatever happened, perhaps in the morning you get triggered into something else because you read a news article or something like this. This not wanting to be exposed now has 51% of the hand of the vote inside of you.
Right.
And so you don't go. And that's one model to explain. In schema therapy, we have a different model, and we use the model of inner conflict, which needs release. And this release can be either an avoidance and overcompensations or surrender. And these are just 3 categories. And in each category, there's a different behavior. And this behavior, for example, could be avoidance behavior, could be drinking alcohol, eating too much, overeating, and then because you're feeling sick, you can't go to the therapist. So everything that we might call as resistance behavior is an outside view and description of the scene, while the person inside might not agree and says, no, I did not resist. I wanted to do it to the therapist, but I had such a big stomach ache because I ate too much.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's different perspectives. The person that is actually the client that has, from an outside perspective, resistance, from the inside perspective, has a completely different idea of why they didn't go to the therapist.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
So from my perspective, if we talk about resistance, there's always a little bit like, you're bad, you have resistance, you don't want to get better. And I don't like that. That's a little bit of shaming and blaming and stuff inside. So I'm just seeing a client who has a certain behavior, and if he manages or she manages to end up in a session with me, we talk about that, and we find ways to understand why part of that client doesn't want to heal, and that is most of the time because there's trauma. So you might, before you go to the real reason why you are in therapy, you might need to talk and heal about other reasons, other traumas, so you can go to the big one, because these others are basically around and are protecting that big issue by being activated it's not really protecting, but they're activated when you're in the therapy session, and they're interfering, and which is from the outside view something they call resistance. From the inside view, it's something else. The client just says, no, I can't do this, I don't want to do that, or that's too stressful, or something like this. But it's just his or her inside view.
Right. That makes a lot of sense, and that's a great way of explaining it. I think that yeah, we all encounter those things in our daily lives, right? And not just in healing, but in general, right? Like people have goals and aspirations, and sometimes it seems like there's this massive wall from getting them to get to that. In my perspective, sometimes I feel it. I feel that duality sometimes with a lot of things in my life. I went. I played a sport recently. I went to a tournament yesterday, and I remember thinking, I'm excited to play the sport and socialize and stuff. And at the same time, there's still always this part of me that's like a little nervous, and it's like, oh, maybe I shouldn't go, And it's kind of who wins that, And luckily, my love for socializing and playing sports, wins that for the most part. But just like anybody, I have my reasons. Sometimes they're not totally clear to me, but they exist. It happens with musicians a lot as well, right? And just artists in general, we tend to think about a piece of art and we love making art, and then we have doubts about whatever, and that those doubts sometimes stop us from creating, continuing, completing. And not just art, this happens to people in business too, who want to create their own future, their own business and stuff like that, and they just can't see it. And there's always a duality. There's that this is just a good example. There's that want, that desire, and then that fear that kind of is at ends. So I think that was a beautiful way of explaining it. I also wanted to ask you about, you were saying there are kind of surrounding feelings that protect from that inner big one, and maybe that's why we can't always just get to that one first, or that core issue, or the big issues a lot. And I don't know if it's related. You tell me. Could you talk a little bit about what a secondary gain might be in terms of trauma? What as I understand it, it's just sometimes we hold on to certain things that are necessarily not beneficial for us because they serve a second purpose. Like I saw a great example. Sometimes and that is that creating drama creates connections. Creating being sick, allowing yourself to get sick or feel down, garners attention from other people and makes you feel loved. And those might sound like crazy things to some people, but they're very real scenarios that, a great example is Munchausen syndrome by proxy, where, right, that's an extreme example, but it's just to prove the point that it's very real.
Now you got to explain what that is first.
Munchausen syndrome by proxy is let me actually Google it and say it in the proper way.
That's cheating. Come on.
Munchausen syndrome by proxy is a mental illness and a form of child abuse. The caretaker of a child, most often a mother, either makes up fake symptoms or causes real symptoms to make it look like the child is sick. So the parent will do this to get attention from others for their sick child, right? So yes. A secondary gain, an extreme form of a secondary gain. But do you think that plays a role in resistance?
Yes, and you asked me to explain it. You already explained it now in a very beautiful way, and yes, that's a form of resistance, I would say, and let's find another example. Let's see somebody who has PTSD and gets welfare or something. Okay, so
right.
That person might go to the therapist and might want to get better. But on the other hand, if that person gets better, the welfare or the insurance money or insurance compensation would just vanish. So they would have to work. Yeah. So there's another part of them that says, no, I don't want to work. It's very comfy to get up at 10 a.m. in the morning. I don't want to stereotype here, but so there are benefits of having that disease. Yeah. And that is definitely a part of resistance. And that in therapy or in coaching, you have to address that as well. To see if we change something, if then some secondary gains would be triggered, and then you already know that you need to make it transparent. to the client. Okay, so the
Yeah.
therapist should not do anything against the wish of the client. So if you as a therapist, you make that transparent and say, okay, look, it seems that there's also some benefits you're having, and what happens to them when we resolve that issue, when we resolve that trauma, and then the client can choose. Yeah, it's their
Right.
lives. It's not my life. I'm not the one who tells you how to live. That's their life to decide on how they want to live. For me personally, I have a very, very personal preference. I want to feel calm, peaceful, and light most of the time, because that simply feels nice and makes life very worth living. And I can't stress that enough. But other people might have different strategies and ideas.
This secondary gain in the example of PTSD and a vet. Maybe I'm looking at it wrong. So it feels like it's an outside force though. Would you say that it's this kind of why would I give up? Why would I want to get better if I'm getting benefits? Would the benefits be a secondary gain outside of you, or still within you somehow?
No, well, with the institute study with the Institute for the Study of Peak States, we would call that, for example, not necessarily a secondary gain, but a dilemma. So on the one hand, you feel bad and you want to get better, and on the other hand, if you get better, you will feel bad because you need to get up early, as an example.
Right.
So that's basically they're crossing, yeah, and then you need to decide on what you're going to do, and these are tricky situations. Okay, because you actually don't move forward, and sometimes our system creates these traumas because that, in a sense, make life very stable, because you don't change. Change is always scary. Okay, change is something. I mean, life is change. You like every day you're looking in the mirror and you think you see the same person, but actually, I don't know how 100 million cells have died since yesterday and have been renewed. So you're not the same person. Biologically speaking, this machine, this body is not the same one as yesterday. It has changed, but it's not obvious to us. And therefore, some people say, oh, change is scary, change is something, and because of trauma. And but it's life. Like, change is life, and and if we resist change, then there are big problems coming our way. But not changing feels safe. So if I have a desire of safety, or if I have the need for safety because of stuff that happened to me in my past, perhaps that traumas that I experienced, that I know of, that are inside of situations I know that going to trigger me and make me feel really bad, I might choose not to do so much, to not get triggered so many times.
Yeah.
And that is basically one of these coping strategies, what I mentioned before, avoidance.
Right.
Yeah. So the coping strategies usually help in a short term to deal with the situation.
Yeah.
But in a long term, they do damage. While trauma healing in short term, can happen when you're skilled. Okay, so you then need 5-6 minutes to heal a trauma. Not in the beginning. You need more time for that. 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, depend on how much resistance you have.
Right.
But the more you do it, the lesser the resistance is going to be, and the more skilled you're going to be, and then it gets quick. But trauma healing techniques usually are for the long run. Okay, so you in the immediate situation, you cope, and you mentioned that loving yourself, and I love that exercise so much. That's, for example, a very, very effective coping strategy to get through many emotional moments. And then when you have some time to breathe, you simply sit down, you do the techniques, or you call your coach, you call your therapist, and do that, and do the techniques, and then release. And actually, I like that. I'm always looking for phrases in languages, and in German language, we have many phrases which are very psychosomatic, that describe how we feel emotionally and what results in the body. And in English, we have that as well, because there's the phrase have a weight lifted off your shoulders.
Yeah.
And if you know what that means, that's basically a moment when a trauma has been released. So when that weight is lifted off your shoulders, that is a similar feeling as when you have a CPL moment, when you have a calm, peaceful, and light moment. Just that weight lifted off the shoulders is something that happens spontaneously. You don't know how to do it. And with these techniques, you can target the issue, resolve it, and then you have that weight lifted off your shoulders moment.
Right. That was beautiful. Thank you for that. I also wanted to talk about there were so many things as we've been discussing that we've been touching on some of the topics as last week, or not last week, last session, last
session,
last talk.
Yeah.
And they tended to talk about the subconscious, and I've been reading this book called Healing Back Pain by Dr. John Sarno. I think he passed away already, but it's a wonderful, wonderful, not just book on the mind-body connection and essentially redefining how we look at physical illness based on emotional factors and how they play a role, how psychosomatic issues play a role in a lot of issues, and we just don't talk about it, or we just don't. A lot of medicine just is very keen on not accepting because there's a lot of difficulties in showing that inside of a lab, which granted is important, but it's limited. So a lot of the book talks a lot about this. I'll just tell you my story to make sense of it. So essentially, we were talking about resistances, and I played a game I played volleyball yesterday. Before I even started, I have back issues, right? So this book is essentially explaining to you that a lot of what happens is there's most likely just going oxygen deprivation due to a lot of unconscious tightening of your body. And it happens for a lot of reasons. One of them being anger, and in his way of thinking, it's irrelevant. Something that happened was that my back has been better and better lately because I've been kind of reading the book, and a lot of things I thought I couldn't do, somehow I can do. So I went to play this. I went to the tournament. I was getting ready. My back has been fine. But in the back of my mind, I'm still scared. I'm scared that I'm going to injure myself, hurt myself. My back is going to give out, whatever. And before I even begin to play, my back begins hurting. I haven't done anything, right? And so the issue is, in the book, he talks about how there's always going to be, it's like your body's trying to distract you from your emotions by putting the pain somewhere else. In a tangible way you can think about it. And it got me thinking about Wilhelm Reich's work in the early 1900s on armoring. And for those who may not know, he was just a therapist that was at first working a lot with Freud, and then he developed this way of thinking, this somatic way of thinking, essentially, that throughout our life, our body, we will create character forms and parts of our body where we hold on to feelings, where we hold on to emotions and sensations that just basically didn't get processed, and they get stuck, and they protect us. They protect us from feeling pain. And a good example is, we see this in TV all the time. And I love that TV does this because we can see it so much more. But sometimes you'll see in movies where men have to cry, and rather than not cry, they'll just like tighten. They'll be like, and they'll tighten so they don't feel, right? And that's a perfect example of what he's talking about. Now, these are more conscious choices, but at some point they had to be made. They had to be made to protect us so that we would get through whatever was going on, especially as children. But I think that's another perfect example that is tied to a lot of the work you guys do, right? You in the Institute, it seems like you guys talk about, I think we've talked about it here too, your consciousness. You can move your consciousness throughout your body, and there are certain parts of your body where you stay away from because there's nasty feelings. If you get too close to that area of your body, you tend to activate that. And we can all, I hope most of us can do that. We can think about putting our awareness in a part of our body. We can think about putting it on our toe, and we can feel, the air flowing in our toe, and had the heaviness of it, or we can put it in our hand.
Chew around it, exactly.
Yeah, we can move it around. But what we might not think about too much is that there are certain parts of our body where we hold a lot more pain than others. And we tend to not want to be in those areas. And I think the work of armor intends to kind of protect you from those things as well. And after a long time, those protections can become difficulties. And it's like you're saying, these coping mechanisms at first can be a great way to deal with something, especially if you're not able to at the moment. You're in some form of survival place. You just don't have the tools. But in the long term, they become this issue where it becomes twice as hard to cry, to let go of feelings, to tap into those feelings, because your body just won't let you. It thinks it still needs to be safe.
Wonderfully said, Sergio. But think about learning how to ride a bicycle. Okay, At first it costs you a lot of effort and concentration. And it's not only because you're a child when you usually learn to ride a bicycle. If you have an adult who hasn't learned to ride a bicycle, because that adult also has to concentrate very, very much. We're just very used that we learn to ride a bicycle as a child. But if you for chance you see an adult doing that, you will see that adult needs to concentrate, and then slowly he or she will get the hang of it, and then every day the adult rides and rides, it gets more smoother, and then they can go around corners and make these curves smaller and smaller, and then perhaps they start to go on one wheel for a second or jump up a curb or something like that. So it's the more you do something and repeat something, our subconscious learns. And then at the end, you can ride the bicycle without any hands, having your phone in your hand and just scrolling through some whatever social media you're having while you're riding your bicycle. So when you do something very often, you learn, and it becomes an automatic reaction. Right. It's the same thing when you're walking up the stairs and you trip. Boom. You automatically, most of the times, catch yourself, and then you realize that you just tripped and that you caught yourself.
Right.
And the same is true when you learn a coping mechanism like this armoring. And I don't really like the word protection. It's just helpful in the moment because it's not protecting, it's hurting you. Because if you do that clenching, what you just very beautifully showed, eventually it becomes automatic and you can't stop it, because your subconscious learn whenever there's emotion, I just do and then I don't feel that emotion anymore, and then it's good. But it's not good, because now you don't feel your emotion, you can't process that emotion. And emotions, imagine that emotions also have a cycle. They come, you recognize them, and they go. And sometimes they come and you don't want to have them, then they stay and stay and stay. And eventually the body shuts them off in 12 or 24 or 48 hours. So then the trauma usually is automatically shut off by the body, and then you're feeling a little bit better. That's why there's this phrase, time heals all wounds, because time doesn't, but the body eventually shuts off trauma, and then there's a little bit more calmness inside of you.
Right. But it can be activated at any point without.
Exactly. It can be true.
You have the ability to turn it off, and those moments they're pretty awful when they happen. So
yes. But this coping mechanism of clenching actually prevents you then, because it's automatic, from feeling what's inside of you, happening inside of you. It prevents you from processing. And then you don't know what's happening in your body. You don't know what your feet are doing. And then you trip more often because you don't know what your feet are doing, basically. And then this accumulates, and then the body needs a way to talk to you, to tell you that something is wrong. And then not only the clenching and the less oxygen might cause something, but there's even like neurological pain or some other sorts of pain which comes because the body basically shows you, hey, do something about it. And that's what we call psychosomatic diseases. One way to slowly reverse that is to get you confident, to get you into a safe space, like a Zoom session or therapist office, and slowly reverse that process of trusting the therapist, trusting the techniques, learn trusting yourself, and slowly reverse that coping mechanism so your body learns or unlearns that coping mechanism and learns that there are other ways to deal with trauma. But it's a slow
Right.
process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
It was
I
also
agree.
a slow process to learn that for the body. It took like a year or half a year or something to do it. And now you have to unlearn it in the same way.
Yeah. No, I agree. One other thing he talks about is not just that it's not just a somatic kind of armoring. It's also a character. So you may become more proud, more prideful, more stubborn. And these are also things that protect you from feeling. Maybe you were attacked a lot when you were in a certain point of your life, and you said, "You know what? I'm just gonna joke around, or I'm just gonna become proud and not listen to anything anybody says, because these things protect me." And we all have these things from one place or another. We're not perfect, and we're all in a certain point of our spectrum. These are just things to keep in mind, that these are also ways to, like you said, to cope.
Yeah.
In certain situations, and then they become what we think of as our personalities. And that person was just, that's their personality. That's who they are. And that's how they were born. And that's not true, right?
No, that's certainly something they developed. And for example, in schema therapy, they call that a mode. Okay, that's an overcompensation mode. I think it's called overgrandizer, or something like this, to put yourself on top of others, make yourself bigger, make yourself grander than you actually are. And that's a way to cope with the feeling, inferiority feeling you have inside of you.
Yeah.
And so you see different authors use different way to describe a very similar mechanism. And that makes the thing also very confusing when you start watching these videos on YouTube and so on. You never know what people are talking about, but eventually you will see, oh, look, that is same, that is similar. And then you create a map in your
Right.
brain, and then you know what people are talking about.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, there's only one thing I wanted to say left, and that is that, in my opinion, it seems like, while it's important to begin to kind of break down these things and let your body start trusting you and let things in, that seems to be the most important thing. That seems to be, and I think that happens throughout the work. Ultimately, there's this metaphor that I tend to see lately, and that has to do with psychotherapy and trauma work. And that is because I recently, not recently, actually, a few years back, I talked to somebody and we were talking about trauma, and it was a therapist, and their perspective was essentially that, trauma will kind of come to the forefront and be ready to heal when it's ready. What she meant by that was, I think that essentially you don't have to push too hard at healing things. When the time is right, it will happen. As opposed to the thinking here, which is with trauma models, with trauma techniques, is that you can just kind of think about it, feel it, and then work through it. You don't have to wait a year until that comes up in a strong way that makes you think about it. Because sometimes that's what happens, right? Sometimes things happen in our lives and there are opportunities for growth, but they're also very painful, very difficult, and we don't have a lot of control over them. And they're great tools to use to heal if you have the tools. But I tend to see psychotherapy a bit more like, in terms of healing, kind of like you have dial-up internet, and then here you have more like high-speed internet, right? Like you have like 200 megabytes per second as opposed to like,
fiber to the home.
Yeah, fiber. Yeah, especially with peak states. I feel like somatic experiencing is a bit more like 200 megabytes, and then you have fiber with like peak states, because it's a lot easier in there, and there are more techniques to work through stuff. You don't just have one technique, so that's also very cool. And I say this because I have my own difficulties, and I can still work through some stuff, regardless.
Well, I don't know what kind of therapist you're talking about, and don't want to say something negative about that therapist, but it's always depends on the model that you have behind it. So when when trauma is, for example, seen as something mystical or something that has sense and has purpose in your life, then you might come to that conclusion that eventually, when you're ready, this trauma shows up and then you deal with it. There's lots of implied assumptions in that phrase, so I don't know what her reasons were. From my point of view, we have a model of how trauma happens in the body. There's a model of the primary cell, which is like a control center where you can change stuff that changes inside of your body. That's the model of the peak states of the Institute for the Study of Peak States, and you can use that model to diagnose, to treat, and to predict. And why is that really important? Because there's always also this prediction. So, for example, you don't have to go to a job interview and fail at that job interview and not get the job, and then go to a therapist and work on it, and then go to the second job interview. You can also prepare. So we can visualize the situation. Obviously, we don't know what you're going to be asked, but we can visualize the situation and we can see how you would feel in that situation. And if you have a therapist who has some creative thoughts, then he or she can give you some ideas, like that somebody's wearing a tie or somebody's not wearing a tie but a t-shirt and it's not really respectful. So you can play with that situation, and you people can really well imagine the situation. And that's, for example, something like professional sports players also do. They not only play on the field, but they rehearse when they're sitting in the bus. They get tasked to rehearse strategies, to rehearse. So your brain is, in a way, as we discussed with the riding the bicycle, is primed, is trained, is automating these movements, these behaviors in a certain situation.
It's creating connections.
And this is the same what we can do for the future. So we can think about how would you feel when you get that job? Obviously great, but is it like positive trauma? There's also something like a positive trauma, so we can heal that positive trauma. How would you feel if you don't get that job? You're devastated. Okay, so we heal that, and then we ask again, how do you feel? And so we can already use something in the future. So perhaps you still feel bad because you didn't want to imagine it so vividly as you could have, and then there's still some traumas triggered, but it might not be that bad. And usually we find that if we do this, so if we start working with everything which is bugging you, which makes your life feel heavy, basically that's how I start with most of my clients. I start, okay, let's make life feel okay, and not completely okay, because there's still some issues which are bugging you, but more okay. And then we basically widen your circle of comfort and widen it. And then they say, okay, now I'm ready to apply for a job which I would have never done like 3 months ago. And then we work and rehearse that situation and see what traumas come up, and then you do it. And of course, with the second and the third, when you get even more experienced, because then you know what's basically happening there. But that is something we can do with our techniques, and I think it's completely valid. So you don't even have to wait until something happens. You can already also prepare. And for example, last week or the week before, with a client, her parent was lying on the deathbed, basically terminally how do you say that? Terminally ill cancer, and she was already really emotional about it. So obviously, in a session, we worked on it. So she felt calm about it. Obviously, it's not a nice situation to lose your parent. So you can't change that situation. You can't make it better, but you can make it better how you feel about it. And this is for most people difficult to understand, that one situation does not need to have that same emotional reaction. We touched on it in the beginning of that chat.
Right? So we talked about it.
Trigger, one stimulus and stimuli, as we call them, not necessarily with all people cause the same emotional reaction. And that is because some people have trauma and some people don't have trauma. And it's still sad when your parent passes away, but it's not perhaps so sad when all your traumas or most of your traumas are healed. And that is something what most of my clients discover even in the first session, that when we work and there's a trauma they have with another person, for example, they're really upset with their boss, then when we heal that trauma, they actually can be very empathic with their boss, and they feel how their boss feels and how their boss reacts. And when that happens, first of all, it's like, wow, like 20 minutes ago, I wanted to shoot him. And now I can see why he is behaving this way,
Yeah.
and I can understand him. And now think about how your behavior towards your boss changes from your boss's points of view. When your boss reacts to you and he sees some resistance, and he can basically see in your eyes that you want to kill him, and then the next day you come because you had a session, and then you just look normal, or even with some loving eyes, obviously his reaction will change. Yeah.
Yeah.
Or, well, if it doesn't, then perhaps then there's a good way to change the job when your boss is so emotionally not available at all, not human at all.
But your
But
perspective
most
and your
of the times-
behaviors are different. You have
Right.
a wider range of what you can see, and it's not colored by your emotions. So it's a bit
Right.
more objective, I guess.
Well, I don't know. But it has changed, and it
Right.
feels lighter for you because that trauma is gone. And the benefit is your boss has the chance also to change his or her behavior. And I
Right.
find that fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah.
And going from I want to shoot somebody to, oh, I understand them now. Oh my God, I have empathy for that situation. That is for most people amazing. But on the other hand, also resistance. Yeah, because some people, when they hear that, what I just said, they said, I never want to have a different opinion about my boss. Well, they won't end up in these therapy sessions or these coaching sessions, and they will carry their trauma, they will carry their negative emotional load, or whatever you want to call it, with themselves.
Yeah.
Until perhaps one day they are ready to change. Yeah, but right now, because of their resistance, they don't want to do it, and that's also fine. But that's their pain they're having, and I can just say, from my point of view, it's wonderful and marvelous to live a calm, peaceful, and emotionally light life. And if somebody takes a different opinion or takes a different, makes a different choice, that's fine too.
Yeah, no, that's definitely one thing I've noticed is that when I lately, that's a great thing to do, just to visualize, because it's a very quick way of of feeling what's going on within you, and to see little things that pop up, right? Like, and this goes for, it could be little things, like I know friends who have a lot of difficulties with family, friends, work, and something as simple as, like you said, just imagine yourself going to the office. Imagine yourself going to visit this person. Imagine yourself doing this kind of project. What comes up? And if what comes up is something uncomfortable and you don't want to, and you immediately push it away, or it makes you not want to go, or it makes you want to give up before you start, like, that's where you need to start. That tells you can, you can make those things better. And
you don't need to start, but it's recommendable to start, because
you don't need to start. You're absolutely right. You can do whatever it is you want, but that's what we're talking about here. That's the topic that we want to tackle here, and that is that you can work with a trauma therapist like yourself to learn how to let go of those things, so that you can not just feel better, but also do the things that you want to do. So there's not this duality or conflict between you, and you have a lot more clarity, a lot more empathy, and you also have a lot more agency of the things that you want to accomplish in your life.
Yes.
And how you want to live your life.
These are beautiful words, Sayu, for ending this chat.
Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, it was great. As always, it's always such a pleasure to talk to you about these things and discuss, and it makes me feel a little smart. So I appreciate the time, and I'm more than certain that with time, this is going to help more and more people. I'm very happy to be part of, I studied psych, but I didn't want to be a therapist because it just didn't feel like my calling, but it does feel like my calling to help push this narrative forward, this paradigm shift, so that we can have people feeling better. We can have also great minds in the medical sciences hopefully start to think about perspective this way, and have therapists kind of open their perspectives a bit more, and learn more about what you guys do as well, because I think it's wonderful. So, thank you so much for your time and for all your insight.
Thank you very much, Sergio. As always, it has been a great pleasure talking to you, and see you soon on our next talk.
Sounds good.
Bye.